So they seek to achieve this godlike state through artificial means, through transhumanism. And artificial intelligence becomes a godlike presence. But the organic element is gone. The organic element fades. So even though they cannot connect with that alchemical Christ stream within them, they still seek it. But they are so distant from the consciousness that it takes to do it, that they do a cheap way. They try to do it externally, add these extra parts. Add a microchip here to the brain. I can just sort of insert my consciousness into a cube. I can live forever. This is the Antichrist impulse in mankind, and we need to understand that. Because there is a desire to not apply these impulses, both the Christ impulse and the Antichrist impulse, to modern times. We still refer to these different impulses and these different ideas as though it's 2,000 years ago, when we didn't even have a third of the technology that we have now. We cannot do that. We have to understand the modernized forms of these impulses and what they're doing and why. We have to understand the Antichrist impulse as a timeline. We have to understand the Antichrist impulse as a consciousness. And we have to understand the Antichrist impulse as groups of people, as an individual, as the Antichrist as an individual, just like we can have the Christ stream incarnate avatars. Okay? There can also be direct incarnations from the Antichrist stream. And in the world, it is these two impulses that give humanity the light and darkness to be who they are. But we can't really consciously choose who we are unless we recognize both of these streams in our life and its effect in modern terms. Because I realize that I'm talking about something that is associated with Christianity. And I know that that makes people feel defensive or uncomfortable, because when you talk about Christ, it only has to be in certain terms. Mainly terms that exclude all esoteric, real esoteric considerations. And when we exclude the esoteric considerations, we exclude being able to interpret them for this modern time. And that leaves us at a great lack, because that is exactly what we are being called to do. Okay? When we see the Christ stream as being that higher force, that golden higher force, it really kind of beams to us purely from the sun, and it contains all archetypes in complete harmony. When we can begin to work with that, that's an alchemical force. It's not just a man, it's an alchemical force that expresses itself in many different ways. Okay? And when we understand that, we can look at different things in our life. We can look at different things going on in the public and say, hey, okay, that is deviating from what I believe the Christ stream is, or what it should represent. And we can make better choices. We can make very good choices when we start to view it this way, okay? So, what is a divergent timeline? What is a divergent timeline? A divergent timeline is a timeline where humanity broke away from the Christ impulse, from the organic evolution and ascension process of humanity. And this was due to opting out of responsibility and going down a regressive path, okay? This is due to avoidance. And that is the divergent timeline. It's outside of organic evolution. It is synthetic, and there is a direct manifestation of it on Earth throughout time. Throughout Earth's entire creation and evolution, there's always been this manifestation of this Antichrist impulse and this Antichrist timeline that forms around this Antichrist consciousness, this descending consciousness. There's so much language around it that we can use. Some is very religious, but some is just metaphysics, right? All right. So now that I'm saying that, I think the best thing that we can do is to sort of understand what an example of a divergent timeline. Now that we understand the metaphysics of it, we understand the esoterica of it, let's get into very, very specifically as to what a divergent timeline looks like, okay? So the most relevant example of a divergent timeline is the grays, okay? Many of you are already aware of the images of little gray beings with often really big black eyes that are associated with abducting people. In the New Age, there's a lot more acceptance for grays, and the story of the grays is very closely examined and talked about with different channelers. And the grays are interdimensional beings that interact with Earth, and they have a very specific journey, a very specific arc, a very specific timeline in connection with humanity. And we can best understand the grays as representing the divergent timeline or the Antichrist timeline. Why? Why do the grays represent that? Because that may actually offend people, because there are psychics and channelers who will connect or channel with the grays, and it becomes almost offensive. But I'm going to ask you to put any judgment or put that aside, because we have to understand that we are all here experiencing, okay? Whether we be a gray or Pleiadian or human, we're all here. We all have light, we all have shadow. And if we really honestly want to say that we are educated on what interdimensionals are here and why they're here and understand our connection to them, we just can't avoid what their shadow is. We just can't avoid what their darkness is, what their karma is, and only focus on light, okay? So the grays are the most relevant and the clearest example of what the divergent timeline is, because the grays are humanity. The grays are a future version of humanity that failed. They failed this initiation that we are in right now. They failed the initiation and they went into full-blown transhumanism. And they became so involved in merging with machines and changing around their DNA, merging it with various animals, different things to survive, that they actually began modifying themselves so much through various forms, really just playing God with themselves, that they began to no longer be able to receive their life force energy. They began to no longer be able to build it up and connect with that God force, because they were playing God with themselves so much that they just degraded to a point where they couldn't connect anymore, okay? And as a result, they began to die out. They reached a dead end within their civilization and they began to die out. They lost the ability to also reproduce, and the world that they were terraforming and the world that they had kind of created for themselves also began to die out. Because the funny thing is that the more you try to play God without actually merging with your higher self, without actually merging with the God force, the more material, the more dense you become, and the more dead you become. And so even though you cannot create or terraform a world or create a body from this level of consciousness that we have, from this more deeper, lower density of reality, we cannot create a world or a being. Only if we are completely aligned can we play a part in the creation process. Okay, see how there's a difference there. Okay, so these beings were playing God, and they fell into what is known as the beast system. Okay, so when you look at the Greys and you look at their story, you are literally looking at a divergent timeline. You're looking at a group of beings now. They actually don't resemble us to such a degree that we call them alien. Many people have such terrifying experience with them, they don't even think that they're human. So this is so divergent from the organic system that we know and that we function in, okay? So you can imagine if you've done this, if you're part of the Grey civilization, you've modified yourself to such a degree that you're dying out and that you're literally not going to really exist anymore. And what they did is they began to trace it back and figure out, where they went wrong, and they did the work on it. And they realized that it was really transhumanism and that failed initiation that we face now that really messed them up and that set them on this tone to be divergent and aligning with that Antichrist regressive impulse. And so they then believed that if we can go back to that time, and these technologies do exist, these time travel technologies or interdimensional technologies, and they had a great amount of technology. Like the Greys have a lot of technology, just not a lot of spirituality, not a lot of real, not a lot of life force. It's like if you can imagine having tons of ability to use machines and technology, but no ability to raise Kundalini, the Kundalini system completely damaged, right? So what they decided to do was, hey, we're going to go back to the time just before we chose to be transhumanist. And we are going to take the DNA and we are going to try to fix and heal our forms from the damage that we have done. And so this is why we see all of these abductions going on and why they took all of this genetic information from humanity, why there's so much, even weird reproductive stories and rape stories and all this kind of really dark and weird stuff that's been going on since pretty much around World War II onward. This was all gathering genetic information so that they could heal themselves from the mistakes that they made by choosing to go into the Antichrist timeline and choosing the transhumanist path. Okay? And so what's really interesting is that the Greys presented themselves as a spiritual force to humanity. So back when humanity was still doing, seances and, channelers were channeling and things like that, there were gray entities that were interdimensionals that presented themselves as very exalted, masterful, higher beings. Okay, and they used false light to do this. So here we have beings of the Antichrist impulse that are presenting themselves as Christ. They're presenting themselves as beings from the Christ stream, even though they're from the Antichrist stream, even though they're from the regressive transhumanist timeline. Okay, here we come. Here we see that mockery. Here we see that inversion. The reason why they did this is that they knew that if humanity They could never just tell humanity what they had done. They could never just tell humanity, hey, we made a mistake, we destroyed ourselves, and now we need your genetic information to heal, so give it up, hand it over. No, they tricked humanity into having seances, connecting with them. They gave them technology, and certain groups on the planet just went headfirst into these contacts because the gray interdimensional beings that were contacting secret societies and these various people, they really chose to contact secret societies and people that were of power, okay? And so they went headfirst into these contacts because they were filling in the gaps of certain very powerful technologies that they could have, okay? Things like maybe the atomic bomb or something like that. But very advanced technologies, very advanced ideas that good forces or beings that were in the Christ stream would not fill in those gaps because they did not feel that humanity was ready. They did not feel like humanity was mature enough. And so you have this direct dichotomy going on where there were groups on the planet, and there have been for a very long time, but there were groups in the modern day, because we're talking about the modern day Christ stream, the modern day Antichrist stream. We're not talking about it from, say, 500 years ago or 5,000 years ago. We're talking about how it manifests today in a techno-advanced civilization. And so we have these two forces, and they're communicating with humanity, and you have beings coming from the Christ stream that are teaching about going inward and building up your life force and how to ascend, and spiritual techniques and healing, self-empowering, know thyself. Great masters, great adepts coming here and teaching from that higher stream, but they do not focus on giving people technology or on helping them build devices as much, okay? And then you have the Antichrist stream coming in, and beings from the Antichrist stream, consciousness is coming in from the Antichrist stream that need to prey on humanity. And so they gave them all these different sort of technologies that they may want to basically almost take over the world, take over the planet. Give them the edge so that they could become dominant, okay? Because remember, in the Antichrist stream, one of the most prominent mindsets is might is right. If I can dominate you, if I can make you look like a fool, if I can dominate you, then you deserve it. Because might is right. Survival of the fittest, okay? I can be an absolute terrible person, and if I can get away with it, it's clearly because I deserve it. It's clearly because I'm smarter than you, and it's clearly because I am dominant. This is the Antichrist impulse. That is how it looks in humanity. It looks like domination. It looks like I don't care about anything or anyone. I have no empathy. I have no compassion. I have no virtue. If I can dominate you, if I can take your energy, if I can set up an entire system on the planet that is a parasitic system, then you deserve it. If you can't beat me, you deserve it. This is the consciousness that we are dealing with today. And it is the Antichrist consciousness, make no mistake. And it is might is right. And it is survival of the fittest. And it is so, so, so different, ladies and gentlemen, to the Christ stream, to your inner Christ, to your Christ consciousness and what it moves out of you, what it does, what it says, what it teaches, is that when we move into a space of love, when we move into the heart chakra, we all move together and are stronger. It says when we move in love and compassion and forgiveness, we can form a higher society by raising our frequency so much that we're actually completely uplifting ourselves into another dimension and density together, where nobody is necessarily dominating anybody else, but there are certainly teachers and wise people and people learning, but there is a ability to connect under the understanding that we are all part of God. No one is trying to be God within the Christ stream, despite what you may have been taught to believe about it. When you are in that stream, you're not trying to be God. You're not saying might is right. You're not saying survival of the fittest. You're saying when you rise, I rise. When you heal, I heal. That is what the Christ stream says. The Christ stream says when you wake up and when you rise and when you remember who you are, the world is better. When you are on fire, you will light others on fire, and we can rise together, and you can channel your unique piece of the cosmos within you. And you can contribute in a way that nobody else can, and that is needed and that is necessary. That is 5D consciousness, and that is a 5D society. When we can understand that, it is not to dominate people, to say might is right. That ain't it. To lock people into some bizarro transhumanist form so they can control your mind and consciousness. This is sickness. This is the sickness of the Antichrist stream that we are facing today. And that is what is meant by the Antichrist. It is a completely different paradigm. Okay? And so back to the Greys. The Greys posed as spiritual leaders, as advanced beings, and gave technologies and posed themselves as a god, but it is an AI god, because what did they do? They became AI beings. They became completely taken over by transhumanism. So that is what they could offer, right? If they were really here to help, if they were really there to help, they would have told mankind, do not go down the path that we did. Do not do that because we have suffered. And look where we are. And yet I have yet to hear one channeler of gray beings teach that. Here we are at the precipice of losing ourselves into an antichrist force, into a negative timeline. And the very beings that suffered from that do not warn us about it, but rather continue often to show themselves as Messiah-like figures, or associate them as spiritual leaders, or associate themselves as above us. We have to start wondering why. And now I'm not saying that maybe there aren't some hybridized gray beings out there, or some people that have overcome this. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that every single being that looks like a gray is like this. That's absolutely not what I'm saying. What I am saying is that for some reason, this extremely important narrative for humanity is completely left out of the equation in the starseed movement, and with a lot of channelers and a lot of different psychics. And for me, I find that to be a very big hole. And I think that it makes it so we have to put more pressure on these connections so that we can understand them, okay? So it's really interesting. The Greys began to communicate with humanity to exploit it. They didn't really care if humanity was evolving or not. They just wanted to basically take humanity's DNA, their genetic information, so that they could basically not die and not die out. That's the fundamentals of it. They had to give them something in return. So they gave them technologies and were working with actually shadow groups, shadow secret societies, aspects of even the shadow government and things like this. They were working with them over a long period of time to actually build up certain technologies or find certain technologies. So it wasn't just like a short period of time. There was the building up and preparing of these people to usher in these technologies and usher in transhumanism, okay? So one of the interesting things that also really brings this home, that we can really connect this idea of who the Greys are, what the Antichrist impulse is if we were to take that whole thing and we were to say, who alive today? What groups today would be the modern version of the Greys? Okay, what groups today would be the modern version, knowing what we know? Well, that would be the transhumanists and also the globalization folks, so the individuals that basically want to consolidate all power, consolidate all human beings, and basically rule the world. Okay, it is this group, and it is the secret societies and the black magicians. It is that whole part of society that essentially moves into and evolves into what we know as the Greys. So this is not a distant concept to us. This idea of devolving, this idea of a lower timeline for humanity. This is not a foreign idea. It's not an esoteric idea. We can look in our society today and we can say, okay, well, if black magicians and dark magicians that are also techno-spiritual, that are making these sort of advanced technologies that are pro-transhumanism, that have made transhumanism a type of weird spirituality. These are the people that would evolve into what we know as the Greys. These are their progenitors, okay? This is not a distant concept. We can look on our earth today very closely and we can see where that Antichrist impulse is, okay? Okay. And this whole thing, this whole merging with humanity, taking DNA from human beings, it's not just about the DNA. It's not just about them getting enough DNA and then they can leave the planet or they can somehow maybe, you know, connect with humanity again or anything like that. This is an ongoing process. And the last step, or the next step in this process, is actually being accepted back into humanity. So the first step of the Greys was basically to make a connection with humanity and in exchange for technologies, access DNA that they wanted. And this went on for decades. Once they got to the level on our timeline where they got the DNA they wanted, the next step is to actually begin to emerge back with society. Okay, they want to begin to merge back with humanity. They want sort of back in. And this is where they want to kind of almost completely hybridize themselves back into basically where they fell from. Okay, and it's very important that we know this. It's very important that we understand that they're trying to heal their process of descension and their process of their fall by forcefully reintegrating themselves into a society, okay? That's really what is going on. And the Greys, as I mentioned before, are part of that divergent timeline. Divergent because, again, by all intents and purposes, they're deformed. Okay, when you put a Grey next to a Grey from the Divergent timeline next to a human being, an organic human being that never took that divergent path, you would have the organic human would just look like a human being, but with intense virile power. Okay, they may have a different stature or have certain ways that they look, but they have so much intense virile power because their soul is so deeply woven into their body. But there's nothing deformed, and that's why a lot of people say that, you know, angels can walk among us, or these higher beings can walk among us, and we wouldn't necessarily know by looking at them, because they're not part of a divergent timeline where they would be deformed in any way. They didn't diverge. They just took the organic path and focused on the inner work of merging spirit with the physical body. And a lot of the incredible advancements are unseen. Okay? So we have the higher breakaway civilization that is the expression of the Christ impulse. We have the lower breakaway civilization, which is an expression of the Antichrist impulse, and that is regressive. And the gray beings are the best example of a divergent timeline that we have, because they literally are humanity. They literally are the timeline of humanity that took the path of the Antichrist. They took the divergent path. They lost their form to the degree that they had to burrow their way back in time to take their genetic information back from humanity. Okay? So gray beings are from a divergent timeline that failed this ascension cycle, which means they have no ability to spiritually initiate humanity. This is a really important part, actually. The only beings, interdimensional, or just human beings that actually have the power to initiate humanity are those that are on the organic timeline. Those that are from the Christ stream, that are connected with that stream. Okay? If there's beings from a divergent timeline, they may be interesting. You may enjoy learning about it. You may be fascinated by it. But those beings do not have the power to spiritually initiate humanity, to spiritually uplift humanity. They do not have the codes. They actually have less codes. They actually have less capacity, less vril, less psychic circuitry activated. That's why they had to go back in time and take genetic information from humans. Because they had to try to get back to the level of power that we are at. We are actually more powerful psychically and vril-wise. We are actually more powerful than the grays. We may be unawakened. It may not be lit on fire. But fundamentally, we are more powerful. Okay? We have more potential. They're spent. So a lot of what they do actually is technology. A lot of the psychic stuff they do is actually mind technology. And it only works on people who are really entrained to that level, okay? Very important to know this. Only beings from the organic timeline and the Christ impulse can initiate humanity, because why? Because they've gone through the process of the fall and the rise, the ascension. And that whole process means that they've overcome. They've overcome something. They've come full circle. In their bioenergetic field, it means that they had psychic pathways that went dark and they separated from them. But then they ended up building them back. They ended up being reinitiated into their light. They ended up creating gold. They ended up regaining their consciousness. And it is that alchemical regaining of one's consciousness that is full of the codes of initiation of humanity. These are specific frequencies. The great initiators of mankind can hold a very specific frequency in their body and entrain you to it. And you don't even realize it's happening, okay? You don't even realize it's going on. It is completely energetic. And what's happening is these codes are being passed to you from that person's real power that they are generating to your body. And that is going in and that is awakening you, massaging you, flowing within you. And that is what an initiator is. It's not the words that they say. It is the exchange of energy that is going on. And in order to do that, in order to entrain someone, in order to do this, that person has to have a lot of vril built up in their system, a lot of life force energy, a lot of power, okay? And that power comes from the ascension process. The ascension process is full of vibrational codes every step you go. You regain them and you vibrate them outward. It is the reconciliation of the light from the shadow. You can only have these if you overcome your shadow. You can only have these if you take on the initiation. You can only have these if you align with your Christ consciousness and allow it to transform you. And then your field becomes full of what? The understanding of the problem. Ooh, you get it? You get the problems of the world because you've been there. But also the overcoming of them. So you have empathy, compassion, wisdom. Okay? Only when you come full circle do you begin to have the codes, and can you begin to initiate other people into that level in which you've mastered. Divergent timelines that have interdimensional beings that have not achieved this initiation that we face cannot initiate you back to anything. They cannot offer you the codes of overcoming because they don't have them, because they chose, when they stood here today as we do, as we are, they chose not to heal. They chose the divergent timeline and they deformed themselves. They cannot initiate humanity. So that may be interesting to talk about. It may be interesting to look into, and maybe there is some conversations around integrating the pain or whatever it is, but that's not nearly as important as understanding that not all interdimensionals are the same. Not all higher beings are the same, because some have actual codes that you can entrain with because they have levels of that Christ stream integrated in them. And there are some that have none of that and that are completely parasitic and actually wish to take your life force from you, or to trick you into false realities, to take your life force from you because they're so deficit. They have none of it left, okay? So it's very important to know that unless you're on that path of organic evolution within the Christ impulse, there is no codes within your being to initiate you, to initiate other people. You have to earn that ability, okay? You have to relight it up within your system, okay? So the grays represent the Antichrist impulse and what happens to humanity under the beast transhumanist system.